Hello and welcome. My name is Jasmine Candlish, and I'm this year's president of the Children's Guardian Fund. Our organization raises money on behalf of children who have been removed from their birth families and taken into the foster care system. Working with volunteers from the Guardian Ad Litem program, our organization strives to ensure that children who are in care are provided with the best and happiest experiences possible while they remain within the system. Any child taken from his or her birth family has, by definition, suffered abuse, neglect, or abandonment, and often all three. As much as possible, we want to reassure these children that they are loved and that they can succeed. Being in foster care isn't easy for any child, but it often seems especially hard for teenagers. Being a teen is tough, even when you're surrounded by the love and support of your parents and your extended family. Now imagine trying to figure out who you are and what you want to do with your life when you have no family support system at all, when it's quite likely you spent a lot of your childhood trying to take care of your own mother instead of the other way around. Today we have with us three people who are well qualified to explain some of the challenges of working with teens whose life histories include far too much tragedy and often violence as well. Pam Heineman is the director of the 12th Circuit Guardian Ad Litem program. She supervises volunteers and professionals who are currently working with more than 1,000 children in Minnesota, Sarasota, and DeSoto counties. We also have with us Gina Krinsky and Dale Otterman, who are both experienced volunteer guardians. They have chosen to work with older children within the foster care system. Teens taken into care soon realize they are probably going to remain in the system for the rest of their childhood. Most of them probably aren't thrilled at that prospect, but actually they have even more difficult challenges ahead. At 18, when they become legal adults, they have to leave the protection of foster care and face life in the adult world without much of a safety net. So let's get started on today's discussion. Pam, could you please fill us in on approximately how many teens are currently in care, and also how many young men and women are likely to remain within the system until they reach their 18th birthdays?
Well, in the Guardian Ad Litem program, we represent almost 200 children who are over 13 years of age, so beginning at 13 up until 18. And we have a couple who are beyond 18 because they have what's called extended jurisdiction. It's something that the child themselves have to ask for. They have to ask to be included as in the system for another year. That means that they still have a case manager who's going to be looking out for them. They can still have their guardian ad litem. Very few children at 18 choose to stay in care and have extended jurisdiction, but there are a few. It's one of the things that guardians are encouraged to do, is to encourage their teens to remain in care. They just need that little bit extra help.
Is that so that they can graduate from high school? Because a lot of the kids, when they reach 18, are not yet high school graduates.
Very true. We have a lot of children who are 18 who may be even just sophomores in high school, because our children tend to be delayed in their education. That's one reason. Another reason would be just to help them get their life plan together. Where are they going to live? How are they going to support themselves? That type of thing. At 13, when a child is in care at 13, it's not that we've given up on them, but the likelihood of a 13-year-old or beyond being adopted, finding a forever family, is very, very low. And so at 13, we start working with them to start making a life plan. They are administered a test called the Daniel Memorial at 13, and it's full of questions like about how do you do your laundry and how do you open a bank account, those kinds of things. Life skills that a child in a normal family would learn from their parents. And so they start looking at where are the deficiencies for this child, and those are things that they start teaching them then. They have classes to teach them, how to balance a checkbook and how to do their laundry, how to cook, how to make a healthy meal, those types of things. And I think Dale may be able to talk to us later on about how an experience she had with one of her teens. But
well, you're our guru as regards statistics, and one of the questions that interested me was the fact that most people, when they talk about foster care, assume that children are placed with a family in a home environment. But for teenagers in our area, I think that's not true for a lot of them. Is that right?
Well, we have, and I don't have the exact numbers of where each, all of these 200 children are, but we know that there are a few who are in foster homes.
Yes.
But you can imagine that foster parents are not like any other, teens. They're hormonal. Even a normal teen, can be very difficult. And then you add to that the situation that they're in. So a lot of foster parents won't take teenagers. Mm-hmm. So that means then that they're going to be either, some of them are lucky enough to live with a relative, but then there are also group homes. There are shelter situations. So some of these teens don't live in ideal situations.
Yes, that's very hard. And about how many children are aging out of the system each month?
I don't know about each month, but there were only 2 this year who turned 18 that the Guardian program represents. Now, I don't know if that's true for all of the children that might be in care, but for us, we only had 2 who actually aged out at 18, is my understanding.
That seems
maybe that was just in
low.
Maybe that was just in May.
Yeah,
that could be. That's probably what it was. You're
Yes.
right. It's probably there were
Yes.
2 in May.
Yes. So they're being launched on the world,
Yes.
and we just have to hope that they're going to fly when they land. Well, turning to our volunteer guardians, first to Gina Krinsky. Gina has a master's degree in social work and was employed for many years in a Washington area hospital. She eventually relocated to Florida, and she served as a guardian in our area for almost 8 years. And I wanted to ask her about children get taken away from their families because of abuse, neglect, or abandonment. And obviously for young children, that's terrifying to have parents who are hurting you instead of protecting you. But I always feel that teens have a special burden to bear, because they realize they're old enough to understand that families aren't supposed to be this way. Could you please, Gina, give us some idea, based on your experiences, what some of the teens in foster care have gone through in their lives? Could you Pam was telling us that some of the children, when they reach 18, are still only sophomores, and she said a lot of the children in care just are not succeeding academically. Could you explain partly why it's so difficult for these young people to succeed?
Well, I think that it's traumatic at any age to be removed from your family and the family that you know, healthy or unhealthy. It's what you know and what you're comfortable with. I think for teenagers, the world is bigger. Friends become very, very important. I want to back up something you said earlier about any teenager in a healthy family situation is a handful, especially females, I think. But with the peer group pressure and the hormones and reaching the end of their high school years, and I think with teenagers, the world is bigger, and I think that. I have a situation now with a girl that is unfortunately going to have to repeat 11th grade because she had so many changes in her living situation, and she missed quite a bit of school this year, so she's going to have to repeat 11th grade. She's in Tampa, she's far from her family, and I think the more you can keep the relationships that she had before, in terms of friends and even in family members, I think that they need that very much, and that's a big support system for them.
Extended family members or siblings?
Siblings, absolutely. And even if the siblings have or not in the case, because if they're under 18 or not in the open case plan, I still think that the whole family needs to be looked at, and they all need to be included. I think if a child's in trouble, the family's in trouble, and it's really important to keep those connections with siblings and other family members and even family friends.
Do you find that there's difficulties when the mother, who perhaps has a substance abuse problem, is trying to reconnect with the teen, and the teen is resentful that he or she is not being allowed to see her mother?
I have that situation right now, and it's very difficult. This child was removed from the home along with 2 other children, and because it's a criminal case, they're not allowed to see their mother, and it's almost been a year now. And I think my wish is that she could, under supervised situation, see her mother, because I still think that connection is so important.
Have you found that it is beneficial? Because it's interesting how different case experiences affect our judgment. I dealt with a case where everybody was pleading for this to happen, but the mother was actually, sometimes you just have to face the fact, mothers are not always a beneficial influence. And I ended up thinking, we were all fighting to get this kid together with his mother, and he would have been much better if he'd never had to see with her and cope with her. Mm-hmm. And it just went on to be utterly destructive when he came out of the foster care system, and she basically told him that he was required to go out and earn money for her drugs. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is the sort of lack of support that we're dealing with,
Right. I think every situation is different, and every family is different. And I think you have to look at that individually and see what is in the best interest of the child or the children.
Mm-hmm. Have you found that with the cases that you've worked that there's been a problem with pregnancies?
Yes, I think that's always, always a looming problem. And unfortunately, one of the best programs, it was actually a state of Florida program, the Character House, was the juvenile program for the state of Florida. It was located here in Sarasota, and it was a wonderful program for pregnant teens who were also involved in the judicial system. And unfortunately, it closed about 3 years ago. And I worked with several or more girls in that program that they were pregnant, and it provided education for them. It provided all the support in terms of counseling and baby care and childbirth, anger management, drug classes, and unfortunately, money. I mean, it closed, and that was a wonderful program, and I met girls from all over the state that really benefited from it.
It is frustrating because that's an example of short-sighted closing and lack of funds, because obviously without that, those are just young women and children who are immediately going to return and be dependent on the state. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I only realized after I started being involved with the foster care system is that for young men who become fathers, this is a problem too. If you become a father, in law in Florida, quite rightly, you are required to support your child. So that if you're a young 16-year-old who impregnates his girlfriend and you're in foster care, you're actually somehow supposed to be supporting your girlfriend. And if you don't, if you get stopped by the police for any reason, for jaywalking and so on, technically speaking, they're supposed to throw you in jail for non-payment of child support. So it really is a huge issue that needs to be dealt with, but I have no idea how we start to tackle it.
I almost think at that age, it's never too late, but I think that kind of education really needs to start, if not elementary school, middle school, that the Department of Education really needs to take a lead in that, to figure out a better way to educate children.
I would like to ask some questions if we could turn to Dale now, who was born in Florida, but then lived in the Midwest for 30 years. She has a long history of volunteering with organizations aimed at helping children improve their educational experiences. And when she returned to Florida, she soon became involved with the Guardian Ad Litem program, and she's now been serving with the program for 7 years. Could you tell us something about the academic challenges that teens have to face when they're taken into foster care?
Well, you know, Jasmine, I think that for most children, their parents, one of their major roles is to explain to them the importance of education. And I sort of look at it as the children's job. And, you know, the parent's supposed to help set the stage for that, talk about homework, talk about school attendance. And all these kids in care have come from a dysfunctional family. And who knows how long that dysfunction has been going on. So many of these teens have never really learned the importance of education and haven't had the support that they need at home. And then we traumatize them by pulling them out of their homes because something has happened, and in many cases move them from school to school, and yet we expect them to keep up with the educational system just like all the other children. And it's very hard for them.
Why do they get moved from school to school so often?
It sort of depends on what the situation is. As Pam said, you know, it's a little bit harder with teens when we have to find a place for them. Sometimes we're fortunate enough to be able to place them with a relative, but in many cases that can be in a different school district, so they have to change schools for that. One of my cases, we had a very hard time placing the young man. He was in the shelter for many months, then moved to Mount Dora to live with a relative. That didn't work, so he moved back. We had him in different group homes, and because of funding, they were closed. You know, things happen. And the children, through no fault of their own, are moved around, and that hurts their education.
I think there's a statistic that I read someplace that every time a child is moved in their educational placement, they lose 6 months of their education. So they've got 6 more, months to catch up.
Well, that would be a frightening statistic, because almost every teen in care probably gets moved
At least once.
At least once, and probably twice.
Yeah.
Yes.
In many cases, 3 or 4 times.
Yes.
And you know, if you also have a child that has any sort of learning disabilities, they really need someone to be an advocate for them in the educational system. So that's probably been going on for years, that they haven't been helped in the way that they needed to be helped. So they're even at more of a disadvantage.
Sort of discovering freshmen in high school who actually don't read very well, or barely at all.
Right.
And so you're trying to catch up on. And of course, there is no support. So when they go home to the group homes, all the time in the group home is taken up with doing just the bare essentials of keeping the house running and functioning and meals on the table. There is nobody who is sitting down and saying, now let's work together on your math problems.
No. You know, there might be time set aside that everybody's told to do their homework, but there's really no assistance in doing that or making sure it is done.
Yeah. Again, we seem to be raising very interesting problems, but I'm not sure that we have any solutions. If you could wave a magic wand, what would be, as an educator, the thing you would most like to see for teens who are in care?
You know, one of the things that I feel in our role as a guardian ad litem, we can try to help and buffer some of that. We obviously can't be with the child every day to ensure that it happens, but to let them know how concerned we are. You know, try to work with their schools to make sure they realize what situation the kids are in. The schools have some safety nets that they can give. There are other organizations, boys club, girls club. You know, you need to reach out and see what you can find that has other volunteers that, can help these kids.
Have you found the schools supportive and anxious to help with kids who are in foster care?
I have. I have to be honest. When you talk to them and explain the situation, they've been very helpful. One of the cases Pam sort of alluded to earlier, I was on a case for 5 years, which is very unusual to be on a case that long. And my young man did actually ask for extended jurisdiction because he wanted me to stay another year. He's now 20, and he still calls me, and I see him 2 or 3 times a month. So we have really formed a relationship over this time. But the schools, when I talked to them about him, they reached out. I even talked to some of his individual teachers who were very willing to work with him and communicate with me. I tried to get him a job at Publix. They were very willing to give him a job. So I do think that that's something as guardian ad litems that we can do.
And did he actually, that particular young man, manage to graduate?
He graduated from high school.
Oh,
he has
great.
actually completed his first year at State College and had a 3.3 average this year. So
Wow,
I'm just
that's
thrilled.
Oh, that's a really nice
Yeah,
success
it
story.
really is a nice story. You know, that doesn't happen all the time. So it is a good story.
I guess, Pam, we really have to address the fact that a lot of these kids, unfortunate children, unfortunately for them, do end up sort of having brushes with the criminal justice system, so that in addition to everything else, they end up with a juvenile record. Is some of that simply because issues that in a family, I mean, if you have 2 brothers who decide to go out in the backyard and fight, and you're the parents, you probably are not going to call the police. I guess if 2 young men in a group home decide to start pounding on one another, the people in charge of the group home call the police, and lo and behold, the 2 young men in question suddenly have a record for fighting or assault and battery or whatever it is.
I think if it, when I look at things that happened to me when I grew up, a lot of those things, oh my heavens, we would have all been in jail if it was like it is today, because every time they have a disagreement, it doesn't take anything, I just assaulted Dale, and so she could call the cops on me if she wanted to. And that's what happens with our teens. And they end up in, juvenile detention or DJJ facility, have to spend time there. Just one more thing, one more strike against them, one more thing that, drags out their time in care.
Yes. And one of the other things, Gina, that I don't think people realize is that in foster care, if you're in a foster home, it's very often the foster home is licensed by age. So you have the system, often it's licensed by age. So you have the situation where the support system in the dysfunctional family may have been that the kids all looked out for each other. Then they end up in care, and it's perfectly possible you can have 3 siblings who are in 3 different homes.
Absolutely.
And the teen who has always sort of felt responsible for them feels helpless on top of everything else.
They're put in a situation many times, especially the older ones, that they are taking care of their younger brothers and sisters, and they've never been a child in many ways, and a lot of guilt and a lot of anger.
Yes, and no way for them really to catch up on the childhood that they missed out on. So, having talked about all the difficulties, why is it that you two, Dale, let's go to you. Why did you decide to work with teens in the system as opposed to cute, helpless little babies who can just, smile and cuddle you? Why did you decide to take on the really difficult tasks?
It's interesting. My first case, I had teenagers, and I enjoyed that. But, I'd said I would take whatever. In my second case, I had babies, and they were cute, but I didn't feel like I could do as much for them as I could for the teenagers that I'd had. So ever since then, I've said, I'll really prefer those teenagers if nobody else wants them, and they keep saying, great, you can have them.
Was that the same sort of thing for you, Jean?
Yeah, I think I think we have an opportunity as guardians to really develop a relationship with these teens, to sort of be their mentor, their role model, teacher, confidant, support system, cheerleader for these kids, and it's a more interesting relationship, and it's when they can speak.
It is. And although sometimes you probably wish they would.
Absolutely.
You don't always like what they're telling you.
But you have to expect that they're angry, they've been in a tough situation, and it's sad, and you have to have you have to understand where they're coming from. And
when they lash out at you, you have to realize it's not necessarily you that they're upset with. it's their lives.
Yes.
Their circumstances.
And I think, you know, it takes a special guardian to work with them because you have to have such patience. I had a teen at one point in time, and it was probably 5 or 6 months before I was ever able to have a conversation with this child, you know, because she just shut me out. You know, we sat and looked at each other during our visits. That was about the best I could do. But,
Well, actually, I've known some teenagers like that, and they lived in my house and called me mom.
right.
So I'm not sure that that's at all unusual.
Right.
We are actually running out of time here, so we need to wrap up. Is there finally something that each of you would like to say? How about a word to people who might possibly be considering that they might like to become guardians themselves? Do you recommend it?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's such an important, I feel like the work that I do and the time I put in is so worth it when you, and sometimes the results are very small that you see, but when you feel like you've made a difference in someone's life, hooked them up to a resource or built a relationship, a trusting relationship, and you may be their only support system. You know, we're all there for the safety of the child comes first, all of us, the case managers, everybody involved. But it's so much more than safety. It's really looking at the entire picture, their environment, their family. And I think it's a lot of what we do is putting them together and putting all those pieces of the puzzle together for them, helping them.
Dale?
You know, I have often felt that every minute that I put in is so worthwhile because you're really affecting the life of a child that's going to go on and do something in our world. And, you know, whatever you can do for that child, you know they'll be better. And some days it's not easy. You know, some days I might be helping the grandmother instead of the child. But, you know, you are having an impact in ways. So it really is a great way to give back to your world.
And Pam, the final word from
Well,
you.
I would like to just say that I don't think it's not all gloom and doom for
Right.
teens. There are a lot of resources available that we can access to help them, but it takes having that guardian there to help direct them to those resources. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. It's been very enjoyable, and I feel more informed, so I hope everybody else does too. Thank you all.
Thank you.